The crisis on the southern U.S. border intensifies. In the Middle East, Israel has launched a ground assault on Gaza after exchanging shells with Hamas militants for days. Here to give us his take is syndicated columnist, advisor to 3 presidents, and the author of the new book, The Greatest Comeback, Patrick J. Buchanan. And later, the Church of England voted this week to allow the ordination of women bishops. How will the move affect the Anglican Communion worldwide? And how will it impact its relations with the Catholic Church? Here to put it in perspective is the Director of Communications for the Personal Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter in the U.S. The World Over Live begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. So much news to share with you tonight. Pat Buchanan and Father Steve Sellers are straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, or if you have a question for Pat Buchanan, call us at 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S. or internationally 205-271-2980, or drop us an email at worldover@EWTN.com, and we are on Twitter at Raymond Arroyo. I'll be live tweeting throughout the show. Let's get started. Here's the brief news from the world over this week. The U.S. government continues to deal with a deluge of unaccompanied migrant children crossing into the U.S. illegally. Here in D.C., President Barack Obama is meeting growing resistance on Capitol Hill to his multi-billion-dollar emergency spending measure for the border. Democrats are expressing opposition to any changes to a 2008 anti-trafficking law that prevents Central American illegal migrant children from being turned back at the border, as is the case with Mexican children who entered the U.S. illegally. This, even though the law is widely viewed as a major contributor to the current crisis. Among the Republican proposals being considered in return for support of the spending measure, National Guard deployment to shore up the Mexican border, expedited processing to quickly return migrants to their home country. And Senator Ted Cruz of Texas said he would seek to repeal President Obama's 2012 executive order that allows some immigrants brought here as youths to stay in the U.S. Republicans contend that that policy is partly responsible for the current crisis by creating the perception that youths can stay in the U.S. no matter their status. Across the United States and throughout localities, they're expressing their displeasure with federal plans to bus migrants into their neighborhoods, following the lead of protesters in Murrieta, California, who turned away busloads of immigrants this past week. Demonstrations have sprung up in Arizona, New Mexico, Michigan, Texas, Virginia, and Washington State. The governors of Iowa, Nebraska, and Maryland have also spoken out against the federal program. Meanwhile, Pope Francis is weighing in on the migration crisis in the Americas. In a message delivered Wednesday to a joint Mexico-Vatican colloquium on the issue, Francis called for urgent intervention for these unaccompanied children who emigrate under extreme conditions and in pursuit of a hope that in most cases turns out to be in vain. The Pope said that these children should be welcomed and protected in this humanitarian emergency. This alone, however, will not be sufficient. He continued, needed are policies that inform people about the dangers of such a journey, and above all, policies that promote development in their countries of origin. In a gesture of the Holy See's deep interest in the crisis, Pope Francis sent Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin to the Mexico City gathering. While there, Cardinal Parolin also met with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. More on this in our next segment. Another papal interview, another Vatican clarification. The director of the Holy See Press Office, Father Federico Lombardi, has questioned the accuracy of statements attributed to Pope Francis in the July 13th edition of the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. Pope Francis spoke with 90-year-old Italian journalist Eugenio Scalfari for an hour. Scalfari, an atheist notorious for not taking notes and reconstructing interviews from memory, touched on several topics. According to Scalfari, the Pope said, quote, "The level of pedophilia in the Church is at about 2%, end quote. He added, again, according to Scalfari, pedophiles include, quote, bishops and cardinals and others more numerous know about it but keep silent. On priestly celibacy, the Pope reportedly said, the problem of celibacy certainly exists, but not to a great extent. There are solutions, and I will find them. Father Lombardi said that the interview, the overall theme of the article captures the spirit of the conversation between the Holy Father and Scalfari. However, the individual's expressions that were used and the manner in which they were reported cannot be attributed to the Pope. This is the third interview the Pope has granted to Scalfari and the third Vatican rebuttal or clarification. House Republicans are moving forward with their plans to sue President Obama for exceeding his constitutional powers. On Wednesday, expert attorneys appeared before the House Rules Committee, which is considering GOP-written legislation authorizing a House lawsuit. Speaker John Boehner has said that legal action is warranted because Obama has abused his authority in carrying out laws passed by Congress. He specifically points to delaying what has become known as the employer mandate in Obamacare, the requirement that certain employers provide medical coverage for their employees. The GOP also takes issue with Obama's unilateral actions to curb emissions from coal-fired power plants, raising the minimum wage for federal contractors, and the aforementioned executive order blocking the deportation of youths brought into the U.S. illegally. Meanwhile, Democrats are moving forward with their plans to exploit the so-called war on women. On Tuesday, the Senate Judiciary Committee considered legislation that would roll back state abortion restrictions. Supporters of the Women's Health Protection Act say the bill aims at eliminating state regulations that masquerade as making abortion safer, but are really just roadblocks to abortion services. During the past 3 years, states have passed more than 200 laws restricting or regulating abortion. The bill has 36 Democrat sponsors. It's not expected to pass out of the Senate. And on Wednesday, Democrat-sponsored legislation that would have, in effect, nullified the U.S. Supreme Court's Hobby Lobby decision was defeated. Dubbed the Not My Boss's Business Act by proponents, the bill fell 4 votes short of the 60 necessary to proceed. It would have ensured contraceptive access for women who get their health insurance from companies with religious objections. GOP senators said Wednesday's vote was simply a political stunt designed to energize female voters and boost vulnerable Democratic incumbents this November. And the Catholic bishops in England are warning against a proposed euthanasia bill being considered by the House of Lords. The legislation would allow doctors in England and Wales to prescribe lethal doses of drugs to terminally ill patients who request them and who are judged to have less than 6 months to live. Current law punishes assisted suicide by up to 14 years in prison. Bishop Philip Egan of Portsmouth said its passage would mark the catastrophic collapse of respect for the infinite value of each human life and each human person, no matter how weak or vulnerable. Prime Minister David Cameron also expressed his worry, saying people might be pushed into things that they don't actually want for themselves. The bill's second reading in the House of Lords is scheduled for Friday. Big changes are coming to the Church of England. On Monday, the Church's General Synod overwhelmingly voted in favor of allowing women bishops. Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said he was delighted with the historic vote and that the long-awaited change marks the completion of a process that started more than 20 years ago, when the Church first ordained women priests. 2 other moves away from tradition were also approved this week. Now an alternative version of the baptismal rite will be available, one that strikes mention of the devil. And liturgical vestments will be optional. Vicars can now celebrate services in street clothes or civvies, be it skirts or blue jeans. Catholic Archbishop Bernard Longley, head of England and Wales Dialogue and Unity Committee, said that the decision on women's bishops sadly places a further obstacle on the path to this unity between us. More about this later in the show. And back in the U.S., Elaine Stritch, the hilarious and irascible legend of Broadway screen and television, died in Michigan on Thursday. She was 89. Stritch garnered 3 Emmy Awards for her work on 30 Rock, where she played Alec Baldwin's mother, but she was best known for her stage work. She appeared in the original production of Stephen Sondheim's musical Company, and later won a Tony for her freewheeling one-woman show, Elaine Stritch at Liberty. Many didn't realize that the entertainer was the niece of the former Archbishop of Chicago, Samuel Cardinal Stritch. A few years back, I sat down with Elaine for what would be one of her last interviews. Just before one of her shows, I asked her how she'd like to be remembered. Her response was typical Stritch.
As somebody who cares enough about her career and entertaining an audience so that she can level with her interviewer before the show, that she's got to go. That's how I want to be remembered. And tell the truth. How about that?
She was a character, and then some. Everybody rise. May Elaine Stritch rest in peace. You know, I'm often asked what was the most difficult interview I ever conducted. Hands down, it was Stritch. You'll see why next week when we air the full interview. And July 17th would have been the 24th birthday of poet and peace activist Matty Stepanek. He died 10 years ago after a lifelong battle with muscular dystrophy. The Matty Stepanek Foundation has been leading an effort to petition President Obama to declare July 17th Matty J.T. Stepanek Peace Day. The foundation got a little boost on Thursday. Maryland Senators Barbara Mikulski and Ben Cardin introduced a resolution for Congress to declare July 17th Matty's Peace Day. The nation's lawmakers will take up the resolution later this summer. You can visit mattyonline.com to sign the petition and support the effort. When we return, we'll talk about the crisis on the U.S. border, the military engagement in the Middle East, the downed Malaysian airliner in Ukraine, and what a certain former president might have done about all of it. My guest was an aide to 3 presidents, author of the new book, The Greatest Comeback. Pat Buchanan is up next, and he'll take your questions when The World Over Live continues. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. The flood of immigrants seeking a better life continues on the southern U.S. border. It is both a humanitarian crisis and one of national sovereignty. But what is the solution? At the same time, Israel has launched a ground offensive against Hamas in Gaza. Given my next guest's experience, he's more than qualified to weigh in on these issues and many more. In fact, he offers some thoughtful answers on the future by looking to the past. In his new book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. He's a syndicated columnist and former advisor to 3 presidents. Please welcome back to the program, Patrick J. Buchanan.
How are you, Raymond?
Great to see you again.
Good to see you, my friend.
Now, let's talk about this.
Sure.
The GOP in 1965 is faced with a 2-time loser in Richard Nixon. Mm-hmm. This guy just lost in a huge way. Mm-hmm. You see similarities between his situation, where the GOP is now. What's the answer? What's the lesson?
Well, the Republican Party in 1965 had lost 2 straight national elections. The last one, a complete disaster, 25 points, 44 states. Nixon himself was a loser. There are a number of things that are part of the answer. The first one is Nixon went out in 1966 and campaigned, first in 1964. He went out and fought and bled for Barry Goldwater in the full knowledge that the party was going down to disastrous defeat to save as many as he could. And he was rewarded with thanks and gratitude from an awful lot of conservatives. 66, he went out and did the same thing, predicted he's going to pick up 40 states at Lyndon Johnson's expense, got 47 states. So that, I think, the idea of loyalty and fighting for the party, which were natural to him, turned out to be also advantageous to him.
Because he even described himself as a progressive conservative, Pat. He was hardly Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan material.
Right. When I went up and had my meeting with him for 3 hours and was hired, he looked at me and said, "You're conservative. You're not as conservative as Bill Buckley, are you?" I said, "I have great respect for Bill Buckley."
Oh, boy. Look at that. The Buchanan
Sure,
dodge right from the beginning.
That was a problem area in the interview I did.
How did you come to meet him? How did you
I met
first
him
meet?
in St. Louis. The first time I met him, I was about 14 years old at the Burning Tree Country Club.
Oh, my.
Sitting on the caddy log out there late in the afternoon when the plaid golf bag of the Vice President of the United States comes out. And the assistant pro looks over at me and my friend Pete Cook, and he's really wary. These amateur caddies are there. And he brought us, and I went around 18 holes with Richard Milhouse Nixon at Burning Tree when I was about 14 or 15. About 10 years later, I'm in St. Louis, editorial writer. I got myself invited to a cocktail party. I wanted to meet him. Went up to him in the kitchen and said, "If you're going to run in 1968, I'd like to get aboard early." 2 weeks later, I was in his office in New York for a 3-hour interview.
Wow. If you have a question for Pat Buchanan, 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S., internationally, 205-271-2980, or drop us an email, worldover@EWTN.com, or you can tweet me at Raymond Arroyo. We will be getting to some of the hot button news that's breaking as we speak, and I know you want to weigh in on that, but I want to get a little further into the greatest comeback.
Right.
There is something in the book, there's a moment where you say, you have these memos that go back and forth.
Right.
And what I love about the book is I've read a lot about
Right.
Richard Nixon, read a number of biographies, read all of his memoirs. I had never seen these memos. Where did these memos come from, Pat?
They came deep in my basement. Look,
Oh, you got your own National Archive in there.
I've had them in there for years and years, have not seen them for years and years, going into them. But what they were was, the way I dealt with Nixon is, he was in the next office, and rather than go in and ask, I would type out a memo, and this, and I'd make a lot of mistakes, as you can see in the memos, typing and things, right? And then I'd put them into a pile and give them to him, drop them in his briefcase. He'd take them home, and he'd come back and write notes the next day, excellent analysis, get in touch with him. No, this guy's a such and such,
Colorful memos.
Stay away from him and everything. Yeah. But we had a terrific communication. And then I spent about 2, 3, 4 hours a day sitting across from him because he was tremendously intellectually curious. He would come in and he said, "Okay, now tell me why you conservatives believe this." And we'd argue something back and forth, and he would come back. Once or twice I came out agreeing with his original position, and he was agreeing with mine. But he was tremendously into politics, personality, issues, foreign policy especially, intellectually alive, aware. And I think, dreaming that after all these defeats, there was still a path down that sideline to the goal line.
What you realize when you read this is the great influence that you had on him. I mean, his disposition was normally to the moderate and sort of to the left. This is the guy who founded the EPA and the National Endowment for the Arts.
He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I said, we got to get rid of that one.
So you were trying to make him ready for prime time in the Republican Party.
I was the first Goldwater conservative, the post-war conservative movement that arose with National Review, Goldwater movement, and the rest of it. The first one, I think, in his entourage. All of the folks previously with Nixon and his staff in '60 really were down on the right wing because they had gutted Nixon in California, the governor's race, disliked the Goldwater people and everything. But I was there, and I was, far, far more conservative than Nixon was, but he was very interested in what you had to say. And I said, look, the thing we got to do, Raymond, is I said, if we can marry the Goldwater right to the Nixon center of the party, there's nobody on the left that can beat us for the nomination. We can crowd them out. And then we can move and get those Northern Catholics who are socially conservative, like my family, the guys I went to school with, and the Southern Protestants who are breaking now because they don't like the liberalism of the Democratic Party, but are currently with Wallace. And we can build a great coalition to defeat FDR.
Is there a lesson here for the political parties as they exist today, for both the Democratic and the Republican parties? The Republican Party, let's face it right now, though they have majorities here in the House and they're creeping up in the Senate, nationally, it seems to be very disunified.
It's hard to see the president. I mean, I could see back then a presidential coalition that could defeat the Democratic coalition of FDR for years. And Kevin Phillips was writing his book then about that very idea, 68, and he came aboard. And what did I say? I wrote Nixon a memo. I said, there is an awesome creature out here in my office. I mean, he was so brilliant. He was so brilliant that he got it and others got it. But today, you know, I can't see it, Raymond. I mean, there's 18 states that have gone Democratic 6 straight times, and they're getting more Democratic, and the demography is moving against us because Hispanic population is growing, Asian population is growing, African and population growing. They go between 70 and 90% Democratic in every presidential elections, and they are growing. And the European American population is gradually shrinking in size. It's moving towards 60% of the population and 70% of the electorate.
Tell me, as you look at the candidates that are out there, Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Paul Ryan and Rick Santorum. And
can you stand the excitement?
I'm glad you said that, Pat.
Shouldn't have said that.
Chris
look, there's a lot of them. I know Rand Paul, and he's got a lot of qualities. I admire his courage in standing up on the war issue.
Can any of them beat Hillary Clinton?
At this point, I don't think so. I think what we need, and here's one thing that Nixon had going for him. It was luck in a sense, but he was coming back at the very point the Democratic Party, the great coalition, twice as large as the Republican Party, was falling apart. George Wallace was ripping off not only the South, but all these populist Catholic conservatives in the North. They loved that message he was giving them, you know. There's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. Then you had the left, Bobby Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, George McGovern, moving anti-war, savaging Johnson, you know, appealing to the kids who were yelling, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And eventually, you know, the Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win. And so all those were inside the Democratic Party, and they were all pulling apart. And that's what gave us the opportunity to seize fractions, big fractions of that party on the center right.
He tells you something very early on. In 1966, he said, before you can even think about 68, running in 68, we have to restore the party base.
Exactly.
Do you see that message needing to resonate now?
I think needing it, I think that's exactly right. But look where the base was in 1965. When I talked to him in that kitchen, that's exactly what he said. Republicans had 140 House seats, the Democrats 295. We had 32 senators, they had 68. I think we had 17 governors, about 1/3 of the governors. And so that base was shrunken, but the base Republicans have got today is much larger, 90 more seats in the House. But you look at the future, and you don't see that bright light over the horizon. It looks like it may be twilight for the GOP.
This is the man who wrote Where the Right Went Wrong, the suicide of a superpower. So much
Death of the West, all that very positive work.
Yeah, all those positive, uplifting books. But everything you write about in those books has largely come to pass. And I mean, we'll get into some of that in a moment. Before I leave Nixon, we have to ask, where did this idea come of the forgotten American, the great silent majority, as he would later
that came out,
them?
I mean, the 60s, what happened, the 60s, you had soaring crimes, you had urban riots, you had anarchy by the overprivileged on the campuses, and all in denunciations and demonstrations everywhere. And Nixon kept saying, look, there's people out there, hardworking people, tax-paying folks who love this country, and we use forgotten Americans and quiet Americans and other phrases. And in one memo I mentioned twice the phrase silent majority, and it's double underlined by Richard Nixon. And it would pop up in 1969 in that great speech, basically that made his presidency, the great silent majority to stand up behind me. Nixon soared to 68% approval. You know, and this was not a charismatic.
Did you write that speech?
Nixon wrote that speech entirely by himself. Nobody helped him on it. But I will say I sent him memos and saying we're at a fateful point in the presidency. Either we're going to run the country, or this crowd out in the street's going to run it. And I think you've got to go on national television, deliver a speech. The next day, Nixon said there'll be a speech on November 3rd.
My goodness. Now look, like Goldwater, you doubled down when you ran for president twice. You didn't tack to the left a bit and try to, it seems you didn't play the coalitions quite the way that
That isn't the way you
Nixon
overthrow a president of the United States. Look, George H.W. Bush was at 90% six months before I challenged him.
Right.
What am I going to go in and say, actually, I agree with President Bush on a number of issues, but I'm a more attractive fellow?
You certainly give a better speech.
You had to come on. That whole idea in 1992 was to go and run a campaign, exciting campaign, and get all these young people out, and hope, frankly, that Bush would say what Lyndon Johnson did. I've served one term, and I don't think I'm going to run.
I've had enough.
And then you'd be running to daylight.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about something else.
Didn't work.
Well, you tried twice, though,
Right.
and you gave it your all.
Right.
Nixon and Reagan, you reveal in the book, had an alliance. I've never seen this anywhere. Where did this come from?
Well, it came out of things in my files and letters and things. And a friend of mine brought some letters that he had gotten out of the Nixon archives, and they seem to be simply letters between Reagan and Nixon, But if you put them all together with the files I had, it looked to me like a deal had been cut at Bohemian Grove in 1967, where Nixon spoke and Reagan was. That's where all the Republican bulls get together.
Yeah.
And the deal was that Nixon would get the first crack at the liberals in the Republican Party, the Rockefeller-Romney wing. And if he hadn't demolished them by Wisconsin, which was the second primary, Reagan would be free to come in and try to grab the nomination. Because the letters were saying, Reagan, Dick, as you know, some of my guys got a little bit out of hand and trying to push me forward, and I had to put them down and things. I understand, Ron, and all that. So, and there was a column by de Toledano which said the deal had been cut, and I sent it into Nixon, and it came back with Nixon's usual check mark. But I had marked that passage where it said just such a deal had been cut, and the very fact that he didn't comment on it told me that he had been the guy behind de Toledano's column. He had been the source. Because de Toledano had been with him ever since the Hiss case.
Interesting. What's the compare those two? You worked for both of these men very closely.
Right.
Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. I hope you're going to write the book about the Reagan years as well.
Right.
Is that coming?
Well,
I know you promise here, part two.
I had about nine years with Nixon and 2 with Reagan in the White House. But this, of course, only covers 3 years. But I would hope to write the sequel to this, and in that deal with the Reagan years as well, the connections between Reagan and Nixon, my days and hours at Reykjavik and some of those other occasions. Yeah.
Those are great stories.
They're wonderful stories.
We will be back in a moment. We're going to get into the immigration crisis, what's happening in Israel, and much more. Pat Buchanan returns after this short break, and he'll take your calls and emails when The World Over Live returns. Stay right there.
Well, thank you. It was,
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. Syndicated columnist and author of the new book, The Greatest Comeback. Pat Buchanan joins me once again, and we're ready to take your calls and emails. If you have a question for Pat, 1-800-221-9460 is the number in the U.S. Internationally, 205-271-2980, or drop us an email, worldover at EWTN.com, and I'll read your tweets as well at Raymond Arroyo. Pat, this immigration crisis breaking out at the border, you've written about this for years and years. What do you make of this situation? What's the solution?
Well, what I make of it, if we don't get control of our southern border, it's becoming increasingly Hispanicized in all those states, Texas and California, New Mexico. And if you get a majorities of Hispanics in those states, in about 10 years, I mean, folks reaching out to those Hispanic folks, if they demand that you open the border between Mexico and the United States, some people are going to concede to that. And I think that's the end of the United States, basically as an independent, separate, unique, identifiable nation. I think you see a quasi-merger of the two countries in this area along both sides of the border. And I think that's the end of the country as we knew it.
Now, some people hear that and they say, Pat Buchanan, these are people who are seeking a better life. These are people who believe in the same faith you do. They bring their values north of the border, and that could be good for the United States of America.
Well, look, there's no doubt these are, first, the children, these little kids and tots are not guilty of anything. Second, the desire to come to the United States, I understand it in every country on earth, and especially those countries where people are under repression, they're living in poverty, they want to have a better life for their children. But you got to have, we're also a country as well. And you got to defend your own national family. And who decides who comes in and who does not? And the United States is currently overwhelmed, both its social programs and all the rest of it. We cannot take in the whole world. In its statement, and the President of the United States has got to make the kind of tough decisions Dwight Eisenhower did. There are 1 million illegal aliens in Texas when he took office, and he told a general, go down and you're going to tell them they can't come into this country and they're going to have to go back. They put them on buses and ships. And this is what I would do. Let me tell you exactly what I would do if I were Obama. I would take the issue from the Republicans, who have been worthless on it, quite frankly, over the years. They talk and talk and talk. I would say, you want your security fence? Give me $1 billion. I will build your security fence. Secondly, I'm going to call the president of Mexico and tell him to keep those buses 5 miles away from the border, or we will come in and take those 5 miles ourselves and do the job, because you are complicit in the invasion of our country. I would do that, and then I would, obviously, if you're not going to send somebody back to his death or something. The other side of Obama is, of course, his compassionate side and his liberal side, if you will. And he probably could have maintained that if he had a tough side as well.
I want to read you an email. This comes from, who is this from? Hold on one second. This is from Donald in New Jersey, and he writes, in the public debates over President Obama's presidency, the argument is raised that the president has out-Nixoned Nixon, or words to that effect. Could a valid comparison between Nixon's corruptions and the present administration's corruptions be raised?
No, Nixon, Barack Obama, I think he's guilty, and I've come out against this idea of impeachment, because I don't think there's any actions that would justify that. Where he's guilty to me is it's the dereliction of duty. It's the indifference to doing what is his response. The security of the states, the borders of the states of the Union, is a presidential responsibility. You can't say, look, I don't think I'm going to do that.
Right.
And so, but in terms of, has Barack Obama participated in some kind of cover-up of illegal activity? Let me say this. If the IRS had been authorized or directed by the White House to go after those folks, little Tea Party folks, that would be infinitely worse than Nixon saying harass some big shot by ordering an audit of his tax return, which presumably would come out okay.
Yeah. I want to shift gears for a moment. I want to talk about something we're dealing with right now in the Middle East. This is an area you visited, and you talk in the book about the early days going to Israel.
We were with Israel. I was with Nixon in Israel in the weeks right after the Six-Day War. I was also with him in '73 down in Florida when the Yom Kippur War started, and Nixon sent everything and tanks and everything else to save the Israeli army in the Sinai. And Golda Meir said that he was the best friend that Israel had ever had. And then you got Nixon on the tapes making comments about Jewish folks. And so what you got to do with Nixon is put them together. He saves Israel. He's got all these tremendous appointments for Jewish Americans, and there's bad language used in the Oval Office. And that's what I try to do in the book. It's, look, here's what he said, here's what he did. You judge.
Yeah, you figure it out. Now we're seeing this military action in Gaza. The Israelis marching into the Gaza region to close down the tunnels where a lot of these missiles are coming from, and they're taking on Hamas. The right thing to do?
The Israelis?
Yep.
Well, I think the Israelis got to make the decision themselves for what they're going to do, and there's no question they're using this opportunity to decapitate Hamas to the degree they can, and to degrade these rockets, which apparently were made in metal shop at Gaza High or something. They're ridiculous little things they've heard. And of course, they were terrible dropping on your city. But I think, you know what Nixon would do now? He would back Israel, but he would be working behind the scenes with the Egyptians. And frankly, he would want to put out lines to the Gazans to stop the killing and stop this thing and see what he can do. He would love to have put something together that stopped this and maybe ended it, at least got a temporary truce of some kind.
Let's go to a call. This is Pat from Texas. Pat, you've got Pat here. What's your question?
Hello. Thank you for taking my call.
Good.
My question is, hello, can you hear me?
Yo, we can
Yes,
hear
we
you,
got
Pat.
you.
Go on. We're pressed for time, so give me your question.
I'm so sorry. What plan components would you like to see put into action to alleviate the current crisis at the border? Not something that should have been done, should have had a wall built, but what about now, the children who are here now?
What would you
Okay.
do about the kids who are here now, Pat?
Well, I think well, look, you don't send the tots who don't have their parents, anyone with them, and drop them back into Central America. But I would, if they're tough teenagers, you can tell them they got to go back home, and they're going back home. And that's what the policy should be, that they go back home unless there's some extraordinary circumstance. You don't send anybody to his death. But as I say, you got to look, the Mexicans are colluding in this. They're bringing these people right up to the border where they walk into the United States, and suddenly they're entitled to a lawyer and a hearing and all the rest of it. And so I think you've got to keep them away from the border. And if they know they can't even get to the border itself, and then they have a security fence, they're not going to come. But why did it take us? Does it take the United States, the superpower, 20 years to figure out how to secure its own border? I mean, the Israelis had a problem in the Negev desert.
Yeah.
They had some terrorist types trying to walk in, and African folks fleeing the horrible situation in Northeast Africa. And he said, we can't take them into our country. So they built a security fence, and it's working.
Let's talk about this Malaysian aircraft apparently downed. The U.S. intelligence we have at the moment is there was a missile launch. That's what brought this plane down. In Ukraine, 300 lives lost. What do you make of this? What side of the border do you think this came from? Is this Ukraine or Russia that launched that missile? What's your best guess?
My best guess is the Ukrainian army did not do it, or government did not do it. I don't believe the Russians did it or would do it, because it was a horrible thing.
Terrible.
It would benefit them not at all. My guess is, and it's only a guess, is that the Ukrainian rebels got control of a surface-to-air missile system, not one of these shoulder-fired things, but one of the SA systems, and they thought it was another one of these supply planes carrying Ukrainian troops or Ukrainian equipment to battle them, and they shot it down as they've shot others down. I don't think any one of these parties would deliberately massacre 200-some people on a Malaysian airliner if they knew it was a Malaysian airliner.
Okay, want to go to another call. Sandra from Arizona. What's your question, Sandra?
Hi, my question is, why can't they put up an electric fence, just like they do to keep cattle inside or dogs, from going out of their yard?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't they put up an electric fence? Well, you got to have a collar for an electric fence, and these are human beings, but to start. But
Well, what you need, I think, is a double-line fence, and then take the trucks in there and make it like a carpet so that you can see the footprints in there. And then you got a tower or something like that manned about every 10 miles, and you got cameras in there, and you got your drones. But if you did a conscientious job, and those guys are not bad people in the Border Patrol, I think you could handle it. You may have to change some laws and tell some folks, look, if you get in the country, I mean, you don't automatically get a hearing or something like that, that we have the capacity or right to just push you right back out again.
this 2008 law, some are saying it should be changed. The president says it should be changed. Now many Democrats are backing off of that. In fact, today, they came out and said, we can't support this. The law should remain as it is, and these children from Central America should be allowed to stay. They should not be turned back.
Well, let me ask you a question. If somebody's being brutalized in Zimbabwe under Comrade Bob Mugabe, do they have a right to come to the United States? Or once they get out of Zimbabwe into South Africa itself, are they any longer a refugee or something like that? In other words, these folks came into Mexico.
Right.
You know, say the Mexican, why are you putting on them a train and sending them 1,000 miles north? And that's, if you got the coyotes that are doing this and you can apprehend them, frankly, you know, if the Mexicans are not respecting our border, I would not respect theirs.
Ted from Maryland, what's your question, Ted?
Mr. Buchanan and Raymond, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
What Roman Catholic Republican candidate has the best chance of success in the next election?
Is there one? Is there a Roman Catholic
Santorum
candidate? I think
is he going to run?
He could.
I don't know if he's going to run. Is there anyone else?
Chris Christie is Catholic.
Chris Christie's Catholic.
I don't know who else.
Well, let's take Chris Christie because Raymond and I were talking earlier, and he held out a tremendous promise. He's a tough guy, and he did extremely well in a blue state, and he's got a lot of qualities of decisiveness that people like, but we just don't know how badly he's been damaged by this bridge gate. And secondly, the problems in New Jersey and financial problems are second only to Illinois, you know. And that place is just about underwater, Raymond.
Well, one of the most troubling things was, you know, Chris Christie is a blunt talker. He calls the press out. He's in your face. When they asked him to comment on the Hobby Lobby ruling, he said, "I have no comment." What? You know, that was peculiar.
That's the calculating response, which goes against the grain of what you want and what you thought you had.
What about Bobby Jindal, one of our tweeters?
Well, you know, Bobby Jindal's done a good job, done a lot of good things, but I don't know if he's going to run, and he doesn't seem to be a strong, prepossessing candidate. He hasn't been out there. I think you need someone with some real dynamism and strength. You know, and I haven't seen it. I mean, he's an outstanding governor, undeniably.
No, he's done some incredible things there. But that's the question: who can hold up to the scrutiny of the moment? But there is, politically speaking, there is a landscape that one sees where there's a path for somebody to emerge and to at least challenge.
I've never seen a situation where no candidate has more than 14 or 15% in the polls this early. 96, Bob Dole started out over 50%. Hillary's probably at 70 or something like that. But I think the opportunity is really there for a Republican if they got it in them and they have some fresh ideas and they've got some real strength of leadership to drive through and win this nomination.
Final question: when you look at everything that's happened since your time with Richard Nixon, what do you regret most about that period, and what do you remember most fondly?
Well, what I regret most is certainly the Watergate, which brought down President Nixon and destroyed a tremendously successful presidency. But beyond that, it was what happened to the folks in Saigon and the folks in Cambodia. When Nixon's presidency was broken and the North Vietnamese overran the South. What'd you get, a million dead in Cambodia, hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million in the South China Sea, boat people, and the loss of the war. America, I mean, the United States Army didn't lose that war, but America lost that war 2 years, about 8 months after he left, or 10 months after he left office. That's the worst. But one of the best are the times with at Reykjavik, with Ronald Reagan, which was, you thought you're almost in a movie, getting up from the table and walking out, and it was terrific. And there were great times with Richard Milhouse Nixon, and one of them, of course, was that '66 campaign, where we bested Lyndon Baines Johnson. Let me tell you a quick anecdote.
Okay.
After the election in '68, we all went to the White House. The staff of Johnson met with the new staff of Nixon, and we were all introduced to the president. We all walked down the line. And I'd been working on Johnson's case for 3 years with Nixon. So we go up and we shake hands with him. And I said, "How are you, Mr. President? I'm Pat Buchanan." And he looked down at me and said, "I know who you are."
That was it. Well, that was like a badge of honor, right?
Let me out of here.
Pat Buchanan, thank you for being here.
Take it easy.
Hope to see you again soon.
Right.
Pat's latest book, The Greatest Comeback: How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority, is available at bookstores everywhere and online. Up next, the Church of England voted this week to allow women bishops to be ordained. Will this decision further divide the Anglican Communion? Father Steve Sellers of the Anglican Ordinariate in the U.S. will weigh in when The World Over continues. Stay right there.
once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. The Church of England made the controversial decision this week to allow the ordination of women bishops. Now, women have been priests and have been permitted to be so since 1974 here in the U.S. Decisions like these have since continued to divide the 80 million member Anglican Communion, with many more traditional members leaving individually and en masse. Now, you will recall in 2009, Pope Benedict XVI released an apostolic constitution creating an ordinariate, sort of a floating diocese through which Anglicans, individuals, and entire parishes could come into full communion with the Catholic Church while keeping elements of their spiritual and liturgical tradition. My next guest is the Director of Communications for the Personal Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, and he's here to react to these latest changes in the Anglican Church and what impact it could have inside and outside of that communion. Father Steve Sellers joins us via satellite from Houston. Father, thank you for being here.
Oh, you're very welcome. Glad to be with you.
Why do you think it took so long, given that there has been a progressive movement for the last 20 years or so to ordain women as bishops? Why did it happen now, do you think?
Well, I think this has been part of an ongoing process in the Church of England, in the entire Anglican Communion. I think it shows that there's still great division among Anglicans and Episcopalians. And so I think the idea of going very slowly with this was probably a good idea. I've got friends in England who are clergy and lay people on both sides of this. And my heart is with them because there is division in this.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Parliament has to accept this. Do you imagine that will go through? That won't be any obstacle?
I think so. I think that's part of the done deal with this. I really believe that since women were ordained to the priesthood in England starting in 1992, this has been sort of a foregone conclusion that they would get to this point. It's taken a little longer than some people wanted it to, and the group that never wanted it to happen obviously never wanted it to happen.
Now, what obstacles do you think this particular decision, and we'll get into a few of the others, what obstacles do you see this presenting to the Anglicans' ability to have ongoing ecumenical dialogue and talks of unity with not only the Catholic Church, but the Orthodox?
I think it puts further strain on it. And I think everyone is still willing to continue the dialogue. I don't think anyone wants to walk away from the table now. I think that we're all sort of under the umbrella of Jesus' words in John chapter 17 that he prayed that we would all be one. There is still a great hope and a prayer that there would be unity, and I think we'll continue to pray that. But I think this does put another little bump in the road for that process, both with the Catholic Church and also with the Orthodox.
When the editor at L'Osservatore Romano writes that this is an impediment not only to future progress, but the progress that has already been gained in that dialogue, it would seem it's more than a little bump in the road. This seems like a point of no return.
Well, there were some who said that 1992 and the ordination of women was the point of no return. Some of us, myself included, we're going to continue to pray that the Lord continues to gather us all back into one. How that works out? Well, in the ordinariates around the world, we have a pathway forward with that. I don't know how you undo what is done. But we are praying that God's hand is shown in this, and there are those still praying for union.
Two other decisions that were made this week. One was to purge mention of the devil from the baptismal rite. The other, making vestments merely optional during liturgical ceremonies. Will this further, do you think, estrange more traditionally minded Anglicans from their communion and make them consider or drive them into the arms of the ordinariate set up by Benedict XVI?
Some of my friends who are very high church Anglo-Catholics in England are grabbing their chest right now over the optional vestments part of it. Sometimes I think that's more troubling to some than the theological things that happen, and it is troubling that they've changed the baptismal rite the way they did. These are just part of the process in England where it's mirroring, I think, more and more what the Episcopal Church did 20 years ago.
Right.
And so and I think that there are those who are very interested in what the Ordinariate has to offer now.
What are you hearing from people now, Father Sellers? And you are the spokesman for this Ordinariate, the Ordinariate in the United States, which
Yes.
was set up as a sort of floating diocese for those who might want to continue their liturgy, their tradition, but would feel more at home in the Catholic Church. What are you hearing from people this week, and Anglicans?
We continue to hear from people all the time, and have even before the action in England on Monday in General Synod. There are those who are yearning for unity, and in spite of the things that go on in individual parts of the body of Christ, there are those who truly want to come together as one. And in the Ordinariate, we're here to help them come into communion with the Holy Father, with the See of Peter. And there is interest in that. I know that Monsignor Newton in England, in the Ordinariate, has already called for a day of exploration for those Anglicans in England who may want to do that. And I think here in the United States, we are also exploring that possibility also.
You know, Father, I can remember when Benedict XVI was in England, and at the end of that historic, and I think it was one of the high points of his papacy,
Yes.
that particular journey,
Yes.
when he announced this Ordinariate. How far-reaching do you see that decision being, even from our standpoint now?
I was the dean of the Episcopal Cathedral in North Dakota when Pope Benedict announced the Apostolic Constitution, and as soon as I heard about it, I had tears in my eyes. I recognize that, as so many did, this creation of the Ordinariates as the most significant and important ecumenical event in 500 years. It was an incredible move from the Holy Father, and Pope Francis has subsequently not only endorsed it, but has expanded our mission to be involved in the new evangelization that is underway.
No, it's been fascinating to watch since that announcement, and then how this has played out with whole parishes and clergy
Yes.
coming over. You yourself, as you mentioned a moment ago, you were an Anglican clergyman. You are
Yes.
now a Catholic priest. Tell us about
Yes.
that journey, particularly as we hear this week Pope Francis talking about the difficulties some people bring to him with regards to celibacy.
Right.
Some say, look, here's a situation where you don't have to be a celibate and you can be a Catholic priest. Explain what your position is.
Celibacy is still the norm for the Catholic Church. Each one of us in the Ordinariates, and we do have a lot of celibate single men as priests in the Ordinariates. Not all of us are married, as I am, and a lot of my brothers are. But we have a temporary dispensation from the vow of celibacy. You know, if God forbid anything should happen to our spouses, we would be celibate. Celibacy is the norm, and the only authority who can grant that dispensation is the Holy Father. So all of our dossiers, all of our paperwork goes before the Holy Father to be able to grant that dispensation. And we are all just so incredibly grateful for not only Pope Benedict creating this, but for Pope Francis and his support for this. And so it's still an avenue, but I think that we're going to see, and of course I don't have any insight into what Pope Francis is thinking at this point, or what he may have said in an interview, but I do know that he hasn't changed any dogma or doctrine at this point on celibacy.
Final question, Father Steve Sellers.
Sure.
As you heard this news coming from England with regard to the decisions made by this General Synod in the Church of England, your first thoughts were what? And do you see this as another opening, if you will, for the Ordinariates, not only in the United States, but around the world?
Well, my first thought was that it was not unexpected. It's sad that it's moving farther away from the traditional Catholic understanding of ministry, but I think it does provide an opening for the ordinariate, at least to help people to explore union as we can live into the call of our Lord that we'd all be one in His name.
Very good. Father Sellers, thank you so much for being here. You can find out more about the Personal Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, the Anglican Ordinariate in the U.S., by visiting usordinariate.org. Well, that is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Very excited about the release of Kerman Durman and the Relic of Perilous Falls, my new children's book. It's coming out at the top of September. I'll share some of the spectacular artwork with you next week. It's really something I'm proud of. And be sure to tune in next time for my exclusive, never-before-seen interview with the late Broadway legend, Elaine Stritch, and much more. In the meantime, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time. Bye now.